Indivisible Lehigh Valley Bethlehem is a newly launched regional grassroots volunteer organization affiliated with the network of nationwide affiliates of Indivisible.org. This is our monthly meeting podcast episode.
All right, hi everyone. I am glad to have a mic down here. I don't think my voice carries that well, but it's really nice to be up here. Like Brooke introduced, I'm Sarah, and I'm coming up from Reading, just down in Berks County, so not super far. And I'm really excited to share more today about a lot of the ICE detention campaigns that are going on. This has been a really big week, and we've had really good news. And I also want to take a minute to introduce myself a little bit more as well. And if you Google me, you really wouldn't find much out there. I have spent a lot of the last 10 years working for my day job in conservation with rural and forested landowners along the Blue Mountain. So I've really tried to keep a profile where I'm not doing public things out very publicly. But I have spent the last 10 years involved in some really incredible campaigns in our part of Pennsylvania, including the Shut Down Berks Coalition, where we shut down the Berks family prison. It took many years, and then during the Biden administration, it was actually closed, and there's no children detained or no families detained in Berks County. So we do again have a children jail, so I will share more about that. But what we've learned a lot from detention center fights is that they're ongoing for the long haul, so I'll be sharing more about that. But I also really got involved in local organizing in 2016 and 2017. I grew up in Berks County, and I went to college, worked in East Africa, and came home when Trump was elected with the sense of like, this is a place to really be focusing right here in our backyard. And I joined a campaign to stop the Mariner East 2 pipeline, which was going through Berks and a lot of the state. And I was working on climate change focused groups on that campaign. And I bring that up because I think it's really important to kind of revisit some origin stories and share in getting into immigrant rights organizing. I came to that through my work in environmental and climate organizing because it's so connected. The right to migrate, to be safe on land and in community is so connected to our right to clean air and to water and to be safe. And there's a lot of overlap between these movements. And I also want to mention my beginnings with climate organizing, because that work from 2017, 2018, that flipped Chester County. A lot of those campaigns were township focused, state race focused. We were trying to elect climate champions to the PA State House. And we did that. We didn't stop the Mariner East 2 pipeline. It was completed, and fracked gas flows through it to Scotland to be made into plastic. And so on the surface, we lost that campaign pretty badly. But along the way, we flipped the county in Chester and elected really incredible leaders, including Katie Muth, who maybe some of you saw in the last week is one of the leaders in our state on fighting the data center expansion, hyperscale data center expansion happening. So I really want to focus on what it means to win. Even when we lose the big campaign, what are we building along the way that's durable and builds power to actually make some of these changes happen? And I've gotten to see that firsthand through all of this organizing work. So I think I'll finish that by saying in 2018, I was in Indivisible Berks, and we harassed Rep. Ryan Costello so much that he just didn't even run for office again. He just was like, I'm out. He was like, the political landscape has changed. It's too violent out there because we had occupied his office. And so that spirit of 2018, and sometimes the victories are like that, where actually someone just disappears from the public scene. And now we have Chrissy Houlihan, who I may not agree with all the time, but she is way better than Ryan Costello and really fights for us on certain issues. So I want to just bring all of that by saying what I've learned from organizing so far is actually pretty optimistic. I think that I feel really moved by how hard people are fighting, and a lot of times we're not seeing that. We're really just feeling the losses and the heavy news that we get every day. But by finding political home and political community, we're actually able to build something that can get us through all of this. And that's what I want to dive in with the Shutdown Detention Coalition. So oh yeah, thank you. Can everyone else see that? Yeah, maybe that's better. Thanks for letting me know. I don't want to move on. And can you remind me what time I should like make sure I stop so we have more time for questions? 2:45. Okay. Yeah, trying to. Great. Thanks. Yeah, 3:15. Okay, can everybody see the screen now? Great. Thank you. So, I'm not sure how much I'll get through. To put this presentation together, I brought together a couple trainings that we have for these different site bites. So we may not cover every slide, but what I really wanted to share is like some of the stories and the big picture of what we're doing and how you can be a part of it. So I want to share some updates about where the DHS warehouse is. I'll mention all the PA detention facilities in the state. Share about the Shutdown Detention campaign members and our values, our current campaign focus on Moshannon and Abraxas, and all these ways that we can take action and that way people across Pennsylvania are taking action. And I also want to touch on the welcoming policy that's happening here in Lehigh, thanks to, I'm sure, some of you. So actually, I'm going to start with that. Well, no, I'll do warehouses and then we'll talk about that. So I got involved with the effort to stop the DH warehouses because I have spent a lot of time along the mountain. It's where my family's from. It's where I go to like escape from the world by going into the woods. And so it was pretty horrific to have a concentration camp proposed literally down the road from like my swimming hole. In addition to it just being awful for immigrant communities to be living with the fear of knowing that something of this scale was coming. And at the same time, I've spent the last couple years as a freelance grant writer working on grant writing for the Pennsylvania Immigration Coalition. So after the Shutdown Burks campaign ended, I stayed connected to those immigrant rights organizers. And when Trump was elected again, I went back to work with them because it felt like one of the more urgent ways to be a part of what's going on. So I've been doing the fundraising work for the PA Immigration Coalition for the last 2 years, along with a lot of other people. And so I guess I have to share about PIC a little bit because a lot of people don't know about PIC, but it's a coalition of 60 immigrant rights groups across Pennsylvania, including Make the Road and other groups here in the Lehigh Valley. And so PIC is kind of behind the scenes serving as the infrastructure that brings together all these immigrant rights organizers and groups and service providers to come together on what they're trying to accomplish and kind of get aligned on how to make it happen. And so when the warehouses were brought to Berks County, it was this moment for me of like, this is like both parts of my life kind of converging with conservation and communities along the mountain, and also the immigrant rights work that's really urgent. So I think I don't mean to like draw this out, but we did have the incredible news that I'm sure a lot of you saw on Friday that Dan Muser confirmed that the warehouses are not moving forward. So please like do some cheering. We need to like actually celebrate this. And this happened only because people pushed back and organized. And I know that includes some of you for calling your members of Congress, going to actions. People like Muser too are so unmovable so much of the time. And so it's a huge deal to actually get this kind of progress. And a lot of people as well like pressured Governor Shapiro. So I'll share more about that in a minute. But it's a really big deal that they're not going to open in PA. And it doesn't mean the fight is over. These warehouses are still owned by the feds, and they're not generating tax revenue. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to share 2 other really good updates that some were in the news, some were not. But from the anti-detention and immigrants' rights work this week, someone who was detained at the Moshannon Detention Center, a man named Izzy, was released and is now home and probably at the hospital where he needs urgent medical care. And he's now able to get that because people fought really hard and spoke up, and members of Congress came and visited him, and he's now free. So again, a really big thing that happened this week. And then down in Berks County, The Abraxas Detention Center is less well known, though not after today. You'll know a lot more about it. But it's a facility that has been like a juvenile detention center for a while. And in the last year, they signed a contract with the Office of Refugee Resettlement to bring unaccompanied minors there. And usually under previous administrations, that OOR program for minors involved social services and foster care and really worked to quickly reunite children who are unaccompanied with their sponsors, with their families. And they usually didn't spend a lot of time in OOR care, but this time it's not like that. They're being detained in a pretty high security facility. And but this week, because of organizing and because of the careful work of really badass lawyers, they were able to release a lot of children from that detention center out into the community to their sponsors. So this was a really big week that we actually have to be really happy about amidst all the horrors. And again, another win this week with Lehigh County approving this policy. So I won't go into this too much because I don't think we have quite enough time, and I want to really emphasize the detention work. But I do want you all to take a moment and follow this call to action. So the welcoming county and city policies are something that immigrant rights groups have been doing through the Pennsylvania Immigration Coalition around the state. And I think this also ties into the detention work, that the way ICE is working after Minneapolis is a lot more behind the scenes. They're not doing so many open raids in the street. What they're doing is really reaching out and digging into working with municipalities, with police departments, with sheriff departments. And I think that's not new to a lot of you, but the extent to which those abductions are happening in conjunction with local government is really high. And I don't know the numbers for Lehigh, but in Berks County since March of 2025, so just about over a year, there's about 80 people who have been sent to ICE to detainment and deportation by the Berks County Sheriff's Department. People who that was unnecessary. They're using Berks County tax dollars to send people to ICE, along with it just being wrong. So this is something where I think our role as allies in supporting immigrant rights groups is to really throw down for these county policies. It sounds a little wonky, and I know myself, and I think probably many of you, we're used to being kind of really knowledgeable on the weeds of policies, and a lot of us really care about knowing how that works. And I speak for myself as someone who went to college for environmental policy. And I think that sometimes as allies, we can get tripped up on supporting things like this because we don't really understand the full extent of it. It's a little wonky, but at the end of the day, these policies are being put together by really incredible teams of organizers, advocates, and lawyers who are specialized in these kinds of policies. And so I just really want to plug kind of everyone taking a moment to bring out your phone or your planner and put the meeting in your calendar to go on Tuesday, July 8th, and show up and support Make the Road and other immigrants' rights groups to urge the county to adopt these policies. What we've seen around the state is that this is what works when a lot of people come to these meetings and they're really supportive and they can dissuade the fear and paranoia of local governments and show that we have their back. That's how we get these policies passed. So put this in your calendar. Do not miss it. This is one of the most impactful things you can do. I probably do not know the day of the week. I would say go with the number, not what I said. Thank you for checking, though. Okay, so just getting that out of the way. I want to bring it back to detention, which is really what I'm here to share about. So here's a map of all the detention facilities in the state of Pennsylvania, not including the warehouses, which were not open and now will not open. But it's pretty also before this year, there were additional counties that were housing immigrants. And fortunately, some of those have stopped because of people pushing back, like up in Erie. But a lot of these have actually only opened in the last 2 years. In 2024, before we went into the Trump administration, we only had 3 or 4 facilities. So the increase is really scary. And I don't want to gloss over that some of these detention centers are run directly by the feds, and we don't have a way to stop them besides targeting the federal government. And that's really scary and motivates us to really work hard for November. But what I do want to focus on is the facilities where they're not just run only by the federal government, where there's a local or state component, because that's where we have power to actually shut them down. Oh, thank you. So that brings me to talking about the DHS warehouses. I think most of you are pretty familiar because we're really close to Berks and Schuylkill here, but they're really gonna go back. In what we've realized since the Berks Detention Center is that a lot of times they're picking communities that there's not a lot of capacity to fight back. It's like these places where it seems so random. There's really low population numbers. A lot of people are, as you can see, average household income of $82,000. That's kind of just making it when it comes to having a family nowadays. So these communities are working class, they're rural, they're people who are often farmers and just or working at Amazon and making it work. And there's not a lot of extra time to be volunteering and learning a whole new like crazy thing about detention. So the fact that a lot of people in both these communities have come together and been organizing and been trying to figure out what can we do to stop these facilities is really inspiring, and it's been really moving to see. And I really want to shout out the group No Scoop Detention in Schuylkill County for the work that they've done. And then in Berks, we have Ice Out Upper Burn, and also a lot of other people in the community who haven't exactly joined a group, but who have been organizing behind the scenes with the township, with the county commissioners, and are really have helped make this happen. So let's see where the order. I think I want to go back to the beginning, and this might be kind of hard to see from where you're sitting, but I'll share it later. I want to point out the timeline that a lot of the story broke in February of this year, but this was in the works for a couple months before that. And I think that's important to note because the big lots that where the Tremont Center is located, that went out of business in September of 2024 and became vacant. And so that facility was running and operational as a logistics and distribution center. So it had enough capacity, but just staff to be working there. And then it was proposed to be I might even be saying this wrong, like 7,500 people in this facility, where previously there had been a couple hundred working in different shifts. And so the scale of what was proposed was just so insane and truly horrific. Like, I feel like I almost gloss over that because it like goes without saying, but it is really worth revisiting that the Shapiro administration was made aware of this on January 9th. And I'm also trying to share things that maybe wouldn't have already been out there. So on January 9th, ICE did notify the State Historical Museum Commission about this. And so the Shapiro administration actually did know about this in mid-January, and the rest of the news didn't actually break until February. So I want to point that out because the warehouses got stopped by Shapiro. The sleeves don't always match up. So it got stopped by Shapiro through going after the water and sewage issues at both facilities. And I think it's really important to note that he didn't immediately take action. I'm sure he would maybe behind the scenes, he was working on it, but he didn't really publicly come out against this and say he was going to do everything in his power until the backlash was already there. He only responded when people spoke up, when they called his office, when they flooded the streets, when they wrote letters to the editor. Something that I've learned from doing climate organizing and immigrants' rights organizing is that Shapiro isn't always our biggest ally on these two issues, but he is movable when we show him like this is the right side of history and this is what the majority of your people like want you to do. So that's what we try and do is to like move him in that way. And so he might not have done this if we hadn't spoken up because he knew about it and wasn't doing anything. So I want to put that out there because it shows like what people power can do. And I try and like hold my cynicism about him. I'll still go out on canvas. But there's something there about like being able to work with what we have. So, as you might have seen in the news, both of these facilities had just absolutely, unprecedented projected population increases. The total number of people who live in Upper Burn Township is less than 2,000. And the people that were projected to be detained in this facility was listed as like 2,500, which is more than the people that even live in the town. And as both communities, Tremont and Upper Burn, already have a lot of environmental issues. There's not at the Upper Burn facility, and again, I'm sure this is things you guys have read, but there's not even water connected to the warehouse as it is. It can't even be operational at this time as a distribution center. And that's been true for like the 5 years since it was built. So both of these facilities, and we're so ill-equipped. In Tremont, the town is has water brought in, and they deal with really horrific environmental injustice issues of sewage being spread on fields. So there's already real water and septic issues in both of these communities that, if these warehouses had proceeded, would have led to just both a horrific situation for the communities there who would like not have like septic or like their own water wells would run dry, and they already do in some cases. But the people that would have had to be in these facilities, it would have been like one of the like worst things that's ever happened in Pennsylvania. The level of just like not having water and food and like the ability for people to keep themselves clean. Like, it would have been so horrific. So it's incredibly relieving that they're not moving forward. Though it means we do need to still support the communities in the country where they are moving forward, because this warehouse proposal as it is has not fully been killed. It's just been pulled back. So it's still something we need to be up on. But I do think that we can really be celebrating the fact that it's shrunk, that a lot less people are going to suffer in this particular way. And for anyone who is interested in the weeds of it, it was really actually pretty creative by the Shapiro administration, like to go after this through preemptively denying the water permits. That's pretty unusual and not something that we really see in our state. And every state like kind of responded in different ways. And that's where the group Detention Watch Network comes in. So I've been working with them, and we just kind of got started really in the last month. But Detention Watch Network brought together all the groups and organizers from around the country who are in these warehouse communities. And because Detention Watch Network already existed and has been building infrastructure around organizing against detention, it was really incredibly helpful to have them already be there, so that when this new crazy thing happened, we could immediately get plugged in and get that support. And I think that just like shows how the immigrants' rights movement is really durable and building infrastructure that is so helpful. And I just like can't speak it up enough. So I think that and I think like the next step with the warehouses is not that it's just like all over and we can walk away. I think there's still calls to action for the other communities like Surprise, Arizona, and the one in Maryland where they're still going to be built. But also our issues in Charlottesville and for the communities up in Tremont, those haven't gone away either. Folks in Tremont still don't have good water, and down in Charlottesville, there's still issues with wells running dry. And so there's still ways that both of these communities really need our support from those of us that don't live in there. And there's also like a way in which the warehouses are owned by the feds still, and they're not going to move forward as warehouses, but we don't know what they're going to be next. So what we're coming together to do is to call on our members of Congress to sell the warehouses, to not just let them be absorbed somewhere else into ICE or DHS or some other federal agency. What we want is for the warehouses to be sold so that they're put back on the tax revenue market. It's probably not the right word. I think I have this here. The amount of like what we're focusing on now is the money side. And I think I could also add that for this organizing, like both of these communities are, there's a lot of people who are conservative, they're Republicans, they're Trump supporters. There's also a lot of people who just aren't engaged in politics at all. I think that's the majority of people. Like, we perceive these communities as being like super red. And when it comes to the voting numbers, that's true. But when it comes to the population as a whole, most people are pretty fed up with how it's working and fed up with both parties. And there's actually a lot we've been able to do to build connections across across difference that people in Schuylkill, in Tremont, and in Upper Burn were not all aligned on ending ICE detention. Like, I wish that we were, but that's not the reality for most communities in Pennsylvania, especially when it comes to like white communities that don't understand the immigration system or don't have a personal reference for how it's failing people. So I want to emphasize that like what we were able to come together on in both of these communities is the infrastructure issues, and now the level of just like massive corruption and waste. And it can be challenging, and I have had challenging moments of like trying to organize with people where we don't have the same values completely, but all we have to do is find one shared value and go from there. And so what we're doing with that now is focusing on the money. I think there is some alignment between the immigrant rights movement is calling for the $240 billion that ICE and DHS have been allocated. We're calling for that money to be canceled, like give it back. We need that money to be spent on the education system, on support for veterans, on our healthcare system, on affordable housing, safe drinking water. Like the list really goes on. And I think there's a really big moment to organize around that shared sentiment. People in Upper Burn are pissed off that the federal government spent $200 million on our state, and it was literally wasted, corruptly gone to contractors, and it's just disappeared. And additionally, there's a lot of tax revenue loss, which I don't think I actually put up here, but for Berks County, we're missing $800,000 that's hitting the Hamburg School District. It's hitting the township roadworks projects. That money disappearing causes real issues for communities. So even though we're really glad the warehouses aren't proceeding, the work doesn't stop, because we all need to be really upset about this waste of money and demand that it's spent back on our communities and invested in the things that we actually really need. So I think I'll take a minute. I don't want to be just talking at you the whole time. I want to take like 2 small conversation breaks and have you turn to your neighbor and think, if you could ask the government to invest $200 million into one thing, what would it be? And if your neighbor is a really close friend or your spouse, talk to someone else. But I'll give you like 1-2 minutes. Think about what you want that issue. What will you spend the money on? So I want to take a few more minutes to share more about the shutdown detention work that's happening around the state besides just the warehouses. The warehouse work is being led by groups local to Upper Burn and Tremont. And like I mentioned, there's not full alignment with the rest of the detention work. And that's okay. We've been able to still do things, but there's some of us like myself who are kind of in both worlds. And that's where I want to pivot a little bit and share about the other shutdown detention work that's happening that isn't just infrastructure focused, that's really focused on human rights. And I'll definitely keep some space for questions if there's more to talk about with the warehouses. I think if I had more time, I'd want to stop and take questions now, but I think I'll just save it. Whoops, sorry, this is going fast. Okay, so the shutdown detention campaign is a coalition of groups from around Pennsylvania that includes a lot of immigrant rights organizers who were a part of the shutdown detention work, part of shutdown detention work in New Jersey. And then it also includes a lot of allies who have stepped up to work on the local side. So especially, it often is a lot of Indivisible groups, like Indivisible Mayday out in Clearfield County, Pittsburgh Women for Democracy. There's like a real moment here where immigrant rights groups and allies are able to come together and try and shut down detention centers. And so it's a really cool moment to actually be able to be united around something instead of just in our regular silos. And in the Shutdown Detention Coalition, we really work according to shared values. This is a huge part of coalition, and I think I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. But when we have a lot of groups coming together who come from different backgrounds, do different work day to day, there's not always like automatic clarity on like, how do we get things done? What are we trying to accomplish? So the way that what I've been learning from the immigrant rights organizers through these coalition structures is that the way to figure that out is through coming together around shared values and then holding each other accountable to that and using values to define strategy and tactics. So what I'm sharing is not the values of all of the ICE warehouse organizers. We have a different set of values and they're a little bit more chaotic. But for the Shutdown Detention Coalition, these are the ones that the group has landed on. And I think, let me think about time. I'm not going to stop here, but I do really want to encourage all of you to reflect on this further. I think that sometimes this can be missing in ally spaces, or it's something that we're not as strong on as what I've witnessed in spaces that are really led by immigrant rights organizers. Like, I think a lot of us come into this like because of our values, but oftentimes because of more like heady things. So what I've really gotten to experience from immigrant rights organizers is being clear about our values and honing them. And so I really encourage the practice of being in conversation with people you're organizing with around what your shared values are and recognizing when they're different and then trying to focus on the ones that are similar. But I think what I will mention for the shutdown detention values is that like leading with the voices and perspectives of the people who are the most impacted is a core value. And when it comes to detention center fights, it really involves having some of the leadership and direction being set by the folks who are currently detained. And so there's a lot of work that happens by the lawyers and organizers who are supporting the people who are in detention to have their voices heard and be listening to what they're calling for. And a diversity of tactics. So we've done some pretty awesome direct action work on some of these campaigns. And I wish I had more time to share about that, but definitely ask me about it. So yeah, I need to figure out what is public, but I'll definitely put it together and share what we can. Yeah, thanks. Because yeah, it's a lot of information that I know we can't go into all the details. But something else so when it came to looking at how kind of the coalition came together in 2023 after the Berks prison was shut down. And then Moshannon opened out in Clearfield County. And to be honest, it was pretty, it seems kind of clear that they shut down the center that was closer to Philly, where there were a lot more people who could organize. And then they opened it way out in Clearfield County, where there's a lot less people and it's a lot harder to get to. And so I don't want to shy away from that, but the group came together and was like, well, now we're going to shut down Moshannon. Like, what do we do next? So coming together as a coalition meant defining values and figuring out demands and targets and building a campaign plan that wasn't just reactive, but is kind of like, how do we map out where we have power and what we can do to actually get this shut down? So for Moshannon, there's actually a pretty clear pathway. And that's why this is all happening, because the Clearfield County commissioners are able to shut this down. And it's up for renewal potentially in September. It could even be earlier this summer. Like, this is really kind of a summer of action, because the county commissioners are, so I'm about to share, they have the power, but I want to add that the second part of the demand is not that this just becomes another prison, but it gets transitioned to something else. It's not replaced by another carceral institution. So in Clearfield County, the targets of the campaign are the 3 county commissioners, Sobel, Glass, and Winters. Let's see. So I'm not going to get fully into the weeds of Moshannon, but what I really want to emphasize is that it used to be a different prison. It sat empty. And then in November of 2021, it opened as an immigration processing center. And this is where we focus the campaign, is on the contracts. So this is kind of a ridiculous arrangement, but essentially the county holds 2 contracts. They're the go-between. They own the facility and they contract out to ICE and they contract out to GEO Group. So it's a publicly owned facility that's run by a for-profit prison company, GEO Group, and then operated by ICE. So it's kind of the worst, both of those are awful. And there's this, pretty wild, circumventing thing happening. It's one of those things where you're like, how is this even legal? But it's what's happening. But because the county is this decision maker, that gives us an enormous piece of leverage, because the county has the power to end both of those contracts. And both of those contracts could be ended this summer. So there's so much more to share about GEO, but I want to mention a little bit about what it really is like in Moshannon, because usually in shutdown detention work, we don't emphasize the conditions of prisons. We emphasize the fact that detention in itself, restraining people from being free to be with their families, by separating their families, detention is wrong. And even if it's really nice inside the prison, it's still against human rights. But Moshannon is particularly awful, and there have been multiple deaths in the last 2 years. And like just the stories are horrific. I actually really don't want to like go and emphasize it too much. But I really encourage you to be like reading some stories and you have the bandwidth to like really be with the horror of it. Because people are being put in solitary. They're not receiving good food. People are having a lot of issues with water. Like it's like a situation where it's just becoming more and more dire, like as every week goes on. And there's immigrant rights groups and Indivisible members who are in touch with people and visit them in the prison, and they're receiving these stories, and it's really heavy. And so the urgency is really high, and that's why I wanted to share about it today. And there's so much out there around, like, you know, they're like, well, it's providing local jobs, and it's like even the jobs are not good. It's not good for people to be in jobs where they're being a part of something so inhumane, and the data speaks for itself. So I will highlight a few of the stories of people. It's heavy, but it's really important to like, to be aware of like what's happening. So I'll give you a minute. Hopefully you can read that. Okay, I'm going to read one of them. When I was with ICE, they tied my feet and my hands, and they gave me food with my feet and my hands tied. I couldn't eat, and many times I asked for water, and they didn't give it to me. I told them that I didn't want to sign anything before to see my lawyer. And no, they didn't let me speak or see a lawyer, and I didn't sign any paperwork. I didn't do that. Never, never. They tried to get me to sign many paperwork, and I said no, no, and I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Someone did it for me. Like the violations against due process are so egregious. And the man I mentioned earlier, Izzy, who was, thank God, like released this week, he had all his papers in order. He was just coming home from visiting family, and he had a permit to do that. And they still detained him and locked him up, and he got kidney disease and was really afraid that he was going to die in the facility. And none of his paperwork was even off. They were literally just detaining him because they could. So, this like is so off the rails that it really needs to be shut down as soon as possible. And so that brings us to taking action, which I'll touch on the ways we can take action around Moshannon, and then I'll mention Abraxas a little bit, and then pause there and take room to just chat more and answer some questions. So there's actually a lot of actions. You can make calls, we send a video, but I want to emphasize this list here. And, members of Congress. Good to check. Yeah. So there's like ways of targeting the commissioners, signing a petition, sending a video message, organizing a local event, which we're doing today, but there's always more out there. They're doing some canvassing. But what we're doing this summer, and I'll just go back, is these actions called Occupy the Lot that Brooke mentioned, where groups around the state are picking a Saturday to show up and having a rally to keep that pressure on the commissioners, and also to keep highlighting and bringing attention to the folks who are in Moshannon and having their voices be heard. So this is something that you can, it's definitely a trek to go 3 hours out there for the day, but it's a really impactful way to support the campaign, especially in this summer of all times. And then the action step around the warehouses is calling for them to be sold and for that money to be reinvested in communities. And again, I'll send all of this to Brooke and we can have it in writing. That's a good question. So the next thing, and I will also, like, because there's so many detention centers and each one is a little different, this could be like a much longer talk and training, but it's also a lot of information to like brain dump. But an ERO is an emergency removal order. And so I didn't make any slides about Abraxas, but I want to mention it that Abraxas is a detention center in Berks County, like I mentioned earlier, where children are being detained. And because it's a facility with minors, it's subject to certain regulatory processes at the state level. So there's permits and and like state inspections that are required, and like licenses that are supposed to be supposed to be held by the facility. And Abraxas has had so many allegations and lawsuits around abuse and real ways that children have been harmed there, that they actually are missing one of their licenses right now. It was revoked by the state in the fall, and it hasn't been resolved, or maybe in January, but very recently. And so Abraxas is a place where children are being detained, and they could be released and put in other facilities that are not like prisons, but are just places where they can get connected to their sponsors. And Governor Shapiro, because he has the power over the state Department of Health and Human Services, they can sorry, I'm like losing my words. Shapiro has the power to shut down Abraxas. He can issue an emergency removal order that just gets the kids out of there and gets them in a place where they're not being abused and locked up for just being children who don't have papers. So a lot of the ways that we're taking action around this issue is focused on Shapiro, because he has a role here, and he his office could be doing this and they're not. So we know that there's certain ways he is working for us and is an ally, but he could do more. Oh, that's a good question about the money. I'm not actually sure. I think that there are a lot of logistical reasons behind the scenes why he isn't doing it. I think probably part of it is his lawyers think it's risky, whereas the immigrant rights lawyers are like, no, like this is solid enough to go for it. So it's an issue of like lawyers disagreeing. So the lawyers I'm going to trust are the ones that are fighting for these kids. I think there are ways that Shapiro, by taking riskier actions against the Trump administration, that does assume some risk. And I think what we've been trying to focus on is the fact that even when, if Trump threatens to pull funding or do lawsuits, like he's pulling the funding anyway. Trump isn't like Shapiro taking action that pisses off Trump. That doesn't actually like put us that much more at risk than we already are. We're already like pretty at risk. Oh, they don't just go on the street. Like they're still going to be held by the Office of Refugee, by OOR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and their unaccompanied minors program. So that program wouldn't just disappear if he issues the ERO. What the lawyers told us actually just this week is that what would happen if they do the ERO is that the children would leave Abraxas and would go to a different facility where there would be much better conditions and where they wouldn't be locked up. So it's really about getting him to issue the removal order from that specific facility, but not fully issuing an ERO from the unaccompanied minors program in general. They're still going to be needing to be in the program and go with their sponsors. I don't know that for sure, but I do think that yes, it's still, at least a lot of it would still be federal. And the one thing I'll add too about Abraxas is that usually like in past administrations, children are moving through the process, and the people working in those roles are like the social workers who are trying to get kids connected to their families as soon as possible. Whereas this time at Abraxas, OOR has changed that policy, and they've kept kids at Abraxas who have identified sponsors. They have family who is ready and waiting to pick them up, and they've gone through the whole process. And OOR keeps them locked up at Abraxas until the day they turn 18, where they miss the whole window they could take to follow the process to get papers. The day they turned 18, they're shipped from Abraxas up to Moshannon, where they're now detained as adults and lose that whole pathway. So I think there's also this thing of like, even if that happens to one child, I don't care how much money it is. We just saw the government spend $200 million on literally nothing. Like we can find the money for it. And that facility is a place where kids are experiencing a lot of abuse that we need to get shut down as well. Yeah, like that ICE getting that $240 billion just opens up so many possibilities that we hadn't even thought of before. And I think that is a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer it fully, but I think there's like a real thing where ICE is doing their thing, and a lot of times we can't intervene in that. Like if ICE is arresting people in the street, we can try and block it, but legally we don't have anything besides our own bodies. But when it comes to where ICE interacts with the state government, or with a township government or with a county government, that's where it's not just ICE and it's not just DHS. That's where state and local government has power that we're trying to use. So that's something that I've learned from the immigrant rights movement is like, we can't fight every battle, but we can find the ones where we actually have power and try and apply it. And I will add that Biden and Obama were also pretty bad on immigration, and that this has been so much worse because of Trump and horrific. But the immigrant rights movement wasn't like set up to be winning even before Trump got elected. Yeah, this is sort of like the pathway to citizenship is kind of like the North Star for the immigrant rights movement. And I had started grant writing with the PA Immigration Coalition in July of 2024. And what they did in 2024, yeah, I could like really go on about this because I feel like it's really cool. Everyone in PIC got together and made two plans. They went through scenario planning. One plan was, if Trump gets elected, what are we going to do and how are we going to come together and pick our battles and defend our communities? And then the other plan was, if Harris gets elected, what's our plan to try and get the system overhauled to get that pathway to citizenship? Like, those solutions aren't like mysteries. They're out there, they're written down. It's just a matter of political will. And so that beautiful plan to fight for even more got tabled when Trump got elected, and everyone pivoted to like, this is the defend our communities plan. So I think there's something about the like long haul battle that the immigrant rights movement has been in around building out the political education of elected officials on like how the system isn't how the system isn't working and the ways it's broken, so that when we do have majority and power, like it can actually just happen. And so I will briefly mention that like the PIC is a part of like PIC and PIC members like Make the Road. There's like a lot of national networks as well that have come together and are prepared for that and like kind of preparing for it. And then even at the state level, PIC has like a caucus of immigrant and immigrant allies supporting elected officials. And so they do regular education with those elected officials on what isn't working, what are the ways we can make it work better. And I really, looking up PICs and their website, I really encourage that, because there's a lot there that like, there's a lot of groundwork and support to build for when we do have those majorities that we're ready to do it. That was a really long answer, but I do want to take some space for other questions if people have them. And thanks for asking them. Yeah, I think that it really adds up. And I think like, and again, this is maybe more just my own opinion, and I can't really be representing like Detention Watch Network or the Pennsylvania Immigration Coalition. But I think that like the more we can show what we want the status quo to be, the more people like Shapiro can take note, and it can embolden him to take bolder action if he knows that like we're voting on these issues and electing a whole sweep of people who are here to fight for this. He can join them then. Any other questions about anything else I covered? Yeah, it's a good question. I think that they're like for Abraxas, there's I don't know what, like I haven't heard like the lawyers talk exactly about like the health examinations of children after detention, but I know on the Moshannon side that like there's this whole process where like, especially because there's a county contract, county officials are supposed to have the legal right to inspect at any time, to show up and just surprise them and be shown how it's going. Same with members of Congress, because it's like part of like federal oversight processes. And just this month, Clearfield County Commissioner and members of Congress have shown up at Moshannon and not been let in. So like, and the one time when they did get let in, like they give them a heads up that they're coming, so they have time to be moving things around. So there's like a real issue of that lack of transparency, because anytime someone is visiting the facility, they've had time to set up a different way of being that doesn't match up with what the folks who were detained have been reporting to their lawyers and advocates. And that's where like really grateful for the congressional officials who have been trying to get that access back. Yeah, and there's still another week. So I think what was passed this week, and I feel like there might even be other people who know more about this because it's your community, but basically there's like a whole slate of what we're calling welcoming county policies. And you might have seen in Philadelphia, they passed the whole slate. Every single one got passed by the city council for the state, for the city of Philadelphia. And in other parts of the state, they're adapting that template to match the local community. So for Lehigh County, that process has been in the works for a while. And this week, what was passed was actually, I literally just took a photo of Make the Roads social media post. This is not that original, but I want to highlight it. So it's prohibiting ICE from using county-owned properties to conduct operations. So that means ICE can't come into the county courthouse and arrest people, which immediately protects people from that situation and others. So there's all these like nitty-gritty ways, like because the ways we have legal power is through where there's that overlap between ICE and local government. We have to like use those windows. So these policies are designed to maximize that. And so there's another policy. I'm not sure what the one is that they're voting on next week or the week after next, but it's like there's just like a various packages. And I think at the city in Philadelphia, they just kind of did them all at once. But in smaller communities like ours, that's not as feasible. It's better to go through things one by one. Yeah, and once it's passed, the next step is to make sure the training actually happens so that local government staff like know what it means to talk to ICE or not. Like walking them through those scenarios of like, what if ICE shows up at your facility? Like those trainings are the second piece that happen once the policy is actually passed. So the work only begins. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. Any other questions or comments? Thanks for all your work.
Thank you for listening to this episode. To get involved, please visit indivisible.org to find our Lehigh Valley Bethlehem chapter. You can also see videos on our YouTube channel for Indivisible Lehigh Valley Bethlehem. Stay tuned for future podcast episodes.